Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. With U.S. aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and other military assets in the Middle East, and Trump considering limited strikes as Iran readies a counterproposal, the transatlantic dimension is growing. Now, European nations, including Poland, Germany, Italy, and Spain, are warning their citizens to leave Iran. Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Study Center, joins us now to analyze the latest. Good to have you back on TVP World. Welcome.
Thank you.
Richard, we're looking at this massive beef up of carrier capacity. One of those carriers actually was used in Venezuela not that long ago. How close are we here? How much is diplomacy still an option? Is this still deterrence, or is this just getting ready for an operational strike?
Well, actually, we see both. We see a serious escalation of tension that has both resulted in a diplomatic impasse between the Americans and the Iranians. But we also see this significant military buildup. And there are two specific tactical observations. First is much of the military buildup is not only to increase the threat to Iran, but also to add strength to the diplomatic pressure on Iran. Second, what we also see is, I suggest the military buildup is also designed to recapture the intensity of domestic disturbances and demonstrations within Iran. In other words, to embolden internal demonstrations against the regime within Iran itself. So the next coming days promise to actually see whether this escalation can be resolved or whether we're closer to a brink of renewed fighting.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, we have the information that what's happened last year in the summer with those U.S. strikes with Israeli support. How much is Israel involved in this? Will they go in first? I mean, we heard reports they're already on standby as well. How much is that going to be a fact in all this?
Well, unlike the June operations, militarily, we see the U.S. taking the forefront in a forward-leaning posture, whereas Israel remains committed to tackling the threat from Iran. It's the American pressure that's much more instrumental. At the same time, there's a key point of disagreement and division between the U.S. and Israel over the conventional capacity of Iran's ballistic missile program. For the Trump administration, the priority focus is, of course, nuclear program aspirations. But the Israelis also want the Americans to target and actually raise the threat from ballistic missile production. So this is more complex than, say, the operations last June. Nevertheless, militarily, there's a lot of unfinished business from the incomplete military operations last year.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's also to remind our viewers that it is a different story with Venezuela and Iran. Iran, much more capable in terms of what they can do. Let's talk about that response. You mentioned ballistic missiles. There is an estimate of several thousand missiles that Iran has access to. If they do decide to counterattack here, let's say the United States goes in, where do you see the scope potential? Where are the targets? Where are the vulnerabilities in the Gulf and beyond?
Well, on the one hand, I think the efficacy of such a deterrent effect for the Iranian regime, let's say as a last resort, to lash out at the West, at the Americans and the Israelis in particular, is actually a bit too much, a bit overblown. I think the regime in Tehran is already weakened by a series of internal demonstrations. And the real concern, on the other hand, is among Iran's immediate neighbors, especially in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf. There is the potential for a wider disruption, a new wave of instability well beyond this particular option.
Mm-hmm. I want to also ask you about collateral damage, which may actually not just be the Israelis and the Americans. But we do also have some European assets, military assets. You have, for instance, that French base, permanent base, about 700 troops in the UAE. What is Europe's role in all this going to be? I mean, right now we have the British who are saying they're not going to allow for some American fighters to be using some of their bases. But inevitably, can Europe be drawn into this as well? How vulnerable is Europe here?
I would say the real priority for Europe, especially over the past several months, is actually dealing with an increasingly unreliable United States. In other words, the rather unpredictable nature of the Trump administration poses its own challenges that are pre-existing to Europe, especially over Ukraine. But this is a fight that the European Union's mission is not well suited for. So I expect the Europeans to be rather sidelined, but perhaps prudently so. The real, I would say, variable is how far and how fast Israel pushes the U.S. into an even more aggressive posture.
Okay. But on that front, I want to ask again in terms of what Europe's capabilities are really briefly, because, I mean, at this point it's changed. We've heard some time ago that European nations have now listed this Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist group. That's something that the Europeans hadn't done for a very long time. I mean, I think the Brits are still yet to do that. The Americans have already done so. Has that changed the dynamic here? Has this made, let's say, that relationship between European states and Iran more adversarial in your mind?
It has, but for a different reason. I think the European Union has shifted its policy, or let's say has become more impatient with the Iranian regime, given the scale and scope of internal unrest. In other words, the real key to the security and stability of the Iranian regime is within Iran itself. External pressure is important, but the real tipping point will be a resumption of domestic demonstrations against the regime. This is, after all, an Iranian government that has lost even the veneer of legitimacy. In this regard, the EU is much better positioned to maximize pressure, rather than just a reliance on the hard power that the U.S. is demonstrating.
I mean, there is that hope, and we've chatted with experts about this, but it does seem like where would that sort of, you said, embolden the populace? We've seen those street protests. We've also seen the casualties and heard of the casualties on the streets. Let's say this does happen and internally a change does come. What's next? I mean, we have groups on the outside. Is there a movement on the inside? What could take shape? I mean, those are critical days and moments. What do you think could happen if that does take place?
Well, that's a very good question, Sascha. What we can say for certain is there's a lingering sense of turmoil, of unrest and dissent within Iran. And second, the difference between perception and reality. It's actually the perception of a potential American and or Israeli attack that is more important than the reality. Where there are military obstacles to an effective military attack against Iran, the perception of a potential attack may actually encourage and embolden a resurgence of these internal protests. But more than that, I think it's very hard to say. And that unpredictableness is more of a challenge for the Iranian leadership on how to respond.
I want to widen the scope a bit, because, I mean, you and I have talked also about the region which you know much about, Armenia, the Caucasus, and Russia. I want to get your sense of what Russia's role will be in all this. I mean, we know they've had recent military drills in the Gulf there and in Hormuz. What is Russia's position in all this? How do you think they would be involved, if at all, if something does escalate here?
I think that's an interesting question, largely because it demonstrates the Iranian regime's sense of betrayal by Russia. In other words, Russia's expectations of support and backing by Russia for Iran have disappointed many in Tehran. So in other words, Russia in many ways remains overwhelmed by its failed invasion of Ukraine and is much less a factor. And after the fall of Assad in Syria, after the American operation targeting Venezuela. I think confidence in Russia as a security partner is greatly decreased around the world.
Mm-hmm. And also a big, let's say, close friend of Iran has also been China. And let's also look and remind our viewers at Strait of Hormuz, a lot of that 14 barrels of oil a day flowing primarily to countries like India, like China. What is that in play? We're not hearing too much from the Chinese. What's their push and strategy going to be in your mind?
Well, that's a good point, because the Chinese are being prudently cautious and actually preferring a silence over any kind of robust response. I think for China, which now has the upper hand over Russia, much more of a dominance, I think China's watching very carefully, and especially observing American military operations with lessons that could be applied to Chinese ambition to retake Taiwan, for example. But regarding the oil, as significant as this is, we should expect China to be actually continually, consistently cautious and rather prudent in not weighing in.
Mm-hmm. All right. And also, I mean, we've had this before. We've had Donald Trump give a deadline, say that he would do something. If we go back to Venezuela, it was like 10 days, but he acted within 2 days. Now, similar 10, 15 days. Do you think that's going to be a pattern? We're going to repeat it, or is there going to be something else?
But to be quite fair and to be quite honest, I have no idea. The unpredictable nature of President Trump and his rather going off script from deadlines is tough to answer. I do think the real question, however, is what the Iranians agree to concede. The ball is in their court in terms of the negotiations with the Americans.
Mm-hmm. And also, ultimately, as you said, you know, the regime is weak, but at the same time, there are negotiations ongoing. So could you foresee a scenario that Trump would be satisfied and this goes back to, let's say, normal relations, if we can call it that?
Well, the danger here is actually a real estate style deal that Trump prefers with the Iranians that fails to address the underlying problem. In other words, Trump may be tempted to accommodate Iran for the short term, and the Israelis would be left bewildered and betrayed. So this could be actually the beginning of a rupture between Washington and Israel. But at the same time, the Iranians have made it clear they're playing for the long game and trying to stall as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And also, it's hard to predict. Just one more line. Where are we going to be with all this, let's say, in a month's time?
Well, I think it's safe to say we should expect lingering escalation, unfortunately, and instability.
All right. So we'll obviously be covering that as much as possible now over the next days and weeks as it develops. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Really, really good insights there. Richard Giragosian there, founding director of Regional Studies Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sascha.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news. Bye-bye.